The story will be told from the perspective of the main female character. I was still in my work clothes when my father informed me that my leg was not worth $12,000. I stood in a spotless hospital corridor in Boston. My surgical scrubs still carried dark stains of blood. I was a second-year surgical resident. That meant 80 hours of work every single week for a paycheck that barely covered my student loans and the high rent for my tiny apartment. My medical degree was supposed to be the promise of a stable future, but in the present, my bank account was empty. The doctor had just explained that permanent disability was likely if I didn't get surgery immediately. I held the phone tightly against my ear. My knee had swollen so badly that the fabric of my pants stretched painfully across it. On the other end of the line, my father exhaled in annoyance. He mentioned that they had just purchased a vintage Jaguar E-Type. My mother let out a long, irritated sigh while my sister laughed in the background. My sister said this situation was simply my lesson for being careless. I didn't cry, I didn't plead, I simply became quiet. Have you ever been told that your health mattered less than someone else's status symbol? I didn't wait for an answer. I didn't argue about the price of a vintage Jaguar compared to the cost of my ability to keep working as a surgeon. Instead, I pressed the red icon on the screen and ended the call. The familiar silence of the hospital hallway returned. I lowered myself onto a cold metal bench. My scrubs were damp with sweat and the blood of a stranger whose life I had just helped save. I inhaled slowly. My anger wasn't explosive. It was precise, clinical. I rubbed my eyes and forced myself to focus. This wasn't a breakdown. This was a balance sheet, and I was deep in the red. I opened my laptop right there in the hallway. My hands were steady even though my knee throbbed with sharp pain. I wasn't searching for sympathy. I was searching for money. I began clicking through every predatory lender and fast cash service I could find. I didn't care about outrageous interest rates or brutal repayment rules. The only number that mattered was the $12,000 I needed to stay in the operating room. I sacrificed my future income to save my hands and my career in the present. Every digital signature I made was a silent vow to myself that I would never allow this situation to happen again. That was when I finally understood something. For 28 years, I had been the silent partner in my family's version of reality, and today my payment was a simple no that sounded like a final notice. A shadow crossed my screen and I looked up. My brother stood there. He smelled faintly of engine oil and exhaust fumes. His face was smudged with grease from a long double shift at the mechanic's shop. His eyes were tired but steady. He didn't ask what our father had said. He didn't need to. He reached into the pocket of his stained work jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. Then he placed it into my hand. Inside was $2,500 in worn cash bills. It was exactly the amount he had received for selling his professional welding equipment. Those tools were his entire livelihood. I stared at the money, then slowly looked up at him. "You sold them," I whispered. He gave a small, tired nod. "I need you walking Wendy," he said quietly. "I'll figure out the metal later." Something inside me shattered in that moment. For 28 years, I had lived in a toxic home. It had been a kind of prison where silence was the price you paid to keep the peace. I believed my quiet endurance made me strong. But standing there and looking at my brother's scarred hands, I realized something else. My silence had never been strength, it had been a cage. I was finished being the victim of my parents' cruelty. My brother wasn't just handing me $2,500, he was giving me proof that family was a choice. He chose me while I was injured. Our parents chose a car. I accepted the money because I needed to remember his sacrifice. I needed to remember exactly who stood beside me when everything fell apart. This was no longer a family drama, it was accounting. And I was about to audit every single one of them. As I lay in the narrow hospital bed waiting for the surgical team to wheel me into the operating room, my knee wasn't the only thing aching. My mind drifted back to the dinner table from my childhood. That table had rules. You only earned a good seat if you were considered a good investment. I had always been placed at the extra table. As the orderlies pushed my bed down the hallway, I stared at the ceiling tiles sliding past overhead. Each one felt like a scene from a long film of every time my parents made it clear that my needs were less important than someone else's image. I remembered when my sister was 22 and decided she wanted to start a health and wellness business. In 4 months, she burned through $35,000 of my parents' money. There were no contracts. No interest rates, no lectures about responsibility. My mother simply said she was finding her light. My father patted her head and wrote another check. He acted like losing money was just the cost of nurturing talent. They saw my sister as an asset worth protecting. They wanted to build her brand, even though she had no idea what she was doing. My story was different. When I was 23, the transmission in my car failed during a brutal winter. I needed $2,200 just to reach my hospital rotations so I could complete my degree. I didn't ask for a gift, I asked for a loan. I still remember the cold look in my father's eyes when he printed a 3-page legal agreement from his office printer. It included 5% interest that compounded monthly. My mother stood behind me while I read it. Her hand rested on my shoulder, but it wasn't comforting. It was supervision. "It builds character, Wendy," she whispered in a smooth voice. "You'll thank us someday. For 6 months, I survived on canned beans. I walked 4 miles through snow just to reach the grocery store so I could save money for the payments. I repaid the loan 3 months early. I hoped they would say, 'Well done.' I wanted a seat back at the main family table. Instead, my father handed me a bill for the notary fee he had paid to certify the contract. Now I finally understood the truth. My parents disguised neglect as discipline. My sister's failures were called potential. My suffering was called character. They labeled me the tough one so they could feel comfortable giving everything to the child who made them look impressive. I wasn't their daughter. I was an unpaid investor in their illusion of a perfect family. For years, they used my patience. They used my strength to absorb the damage caused by my sister's mistakes. But as the anesthesiologist approached with the mask, my mind became cold and focused. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I wasn't just there to repair my leg. I was there to close an account that had been open for far too long. For 28 years, my parents had trained me to value contracts over people. Now it was time to show them exactly how well I had learned their lessons. I woke up later to the sharp smell of disinfectant and the heavy pressure of a metal brace wrapped around my leg. The surgery had been successful, but during my recovery, my family offered nothing. While I struggled through rehabilitation, learning to walk again one painful step at a time, my phone stayed silent. No messages, no cards, no calls from my mother asking about my pain. My father didn't even send a text to check whether the surgery he refused to fund had worked. Eventually, the bandages disappeared and I was fitted with a professional brace. Around that same time, my workers' compensation settlement arrived. I had been injured while helping save a patient during a major emergency. The payout was $500,000. To the insurance company, it was a routine expense. To me, it was the capital I needed to destroy my father's business. For the first time in my life, I had serious money. I sat alone in my quiet apartment with the check resting on the table. That silence from my parents suddenly felt like a signal from the market. I was no longer a problem they needed to manage. In their world of luxury brands and appearances, I simply didn't exist. The silence finally ended on a Tuesday evening, but it wasn't the phone call I deserved. It was my mother. Her voice sounded sharp and stressed. She didn't ask about my knee or whether I could walk without crutches. Instead, she began scolding me for missing the celebration party for the vintage Jaguar E-Type. "Your father worked extremely hard for this, Wendy," she snapped. "The local car club will be there. We told everyone you'd be here helping serve. Your absence makes us look fragmented." It's negligent. I looked down at the red scars across my knee. Then I thought about the debt I knew they had buried beneath the leather seats of that car. My sister joined the call on another line. Her voice was sugary and fake. "Come on, Wendy, just wear a long dress. Nobody will notice the brace. Stop being dramatic and do something for the family for once." The nerve they had was incredible. They wanted me to stand there like decoration in their fake world so they could look successful. "I won't be there," I said calmly. I offered no explanation, no medical excuse, no anger. I simply hung up and watched the screen go dark. This time my anger wasn't loud, it was strategy. For 28 years, my parents had drained every drop of kindness from me. And I was finally closing the account. Instead of reviewing my rehab schedule, I picked up the phone and called a high-end financial lawyer in downtown Boston. He was expensive and well known for winning ruthless cases. When he answered, I didn't sound like a wounded daughter. I sounded like a CEO. "I want to initiate an audit," I told him. I want to know every cent my parents owe, every lien on their property, and exactly how much it will cost to buy their entire world out from under them. This wasn't revenge, this was accounting. A few days later, I was sitting in his office. It was made of glass and steel. He did not offer me any tea or say nice things about family. Instead, he pushed a thick folder across his big desk. "This is the story your parents tell themselves," he said. I opened the folder and watched their success fall apart in seconds. The house I grew up in, which my mother called her nest egg, was fully leveraged. They had refinanced it many times and were 3 months behind on payments. The vintage Jaguar my father used as an excuse to ignore my injury was bought with a loan based on money he did not even have. My sister's business was losing cash every day. They were paying her workers by taking money out of the house, which was already worth less than the debt. They were not rich, they were just very good at pretending. My father did not refuse to pay for my surgery because he loved a car more than me. He refused because he was a financial arsonist trying to keep the fire away from his curtains. I looked at the numbers until my eyes hurt. They refused to give me $12,000 to save my career while they threw away hundreds of thousands to look good for a car club. Can we protect you from this? My lawyer asked, shield your assets so you're not exposed when it collapses. I closed the folder. No, I said I don't want to run from their debt. I want to own it. That was the moment the plan became real. We moved fast and quiet. I started a shell company with no names or family links. It was just a clean business entity. My lawyer talked to the banks that held my parents' bad debt. Banks do not like loans that are not being paid. They like cash. They will trade a bad loan for real money very quickly. With my $500,000, I went after their late mortgage and the Jaguar loan. I did not buy the house. I bought the right to take it from them. I became my parents' main creditor. They did not even know my name was on the debts. I did not do it because I was greedy. I did it for clarity. Within 48 hours, I went from the daughter they ignored to the shadow landlord who owned their house, their car, and their stability. They had no idea. That was the coldest part of my plan. I sat in my apartment and realized that if I told them the truth, they would never sign the papers I needed. So I did not go to them as Wendy. I went as opportunity. A middleman reached out for my company. He offered them a deal to sell the house and lease it back. It meant they got immediate help and no public shame. He even offered a small line of credit for my sister's failing business. They signed every single page of the 50-page contract without reading the small print. They thought the rules did not apply to people who looked as successful as they did. When the pen hit the paper, I felt a weight leave my chest. I was not just walking again. I was standing on their foundation. The air in the lawyer's office was thick with the smell of paper and bad news. I sat perfectly still as he opened a second, thinner folder. I thought I had seen the worst of it, the debt, the lies, and the fake lifestyle. But as the lawyer showed me a trust fund document, I realized I had only seen the surface of what they did. My father had not just spent money he did not have. He had destroyed the future of the only person who actually loved me. My grandfather had left $45,000 in a special trust for Calb. It was meant to be the money for Calb to open his own mechanic shop after years of hard work, but the account was empty. I looked at the withdrawal paper, my eyes fixed on the signature at the bottom. It was Calb's name, but the writing was too smooth. It was not my brother's shaky, grease-stained handwriting. It was my father's elegant clinical script. Robert had forged his own son's signature to pay for his delusions. He had stolen $45,000 from a 26-year-old man who worked 60 hours a week just to keep my father's house from being taken by the bank. I thought about Calb's scarred hands. He had sold his only tools to save my leg while our father was driving Calb's stolen dreams in a vintage Jaguar. This was not just a family fight anymore. This was a felony. In that moment, I felt the weight of being the one who watches. I had spent years watching Calb get worn down. I had felt a quiet guilt that I could not do more to help him. But now I realized I had seen a crime I did not even know was happening. My father treated Calb like a resource to be used, and my mother just stood by and watched the light go out in her son's eyes. I stared at the fake signature. My anger was not loud, it was a strategy. My father's name on that paper was more than a confession, it was the final payout on a life of neglect. I had been the silent partner in their version of a family, and I was finally calling in the debt. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and Robert was about to find out exactly what happens when you use up a daughter's mercy. I did not ask for a legal opinion. I looked at my lawyer and gave him the only order that mattered. I want the criminal evidence ready, I said. I'm not just his landlord anymore. I'm the one who holds the warrant. This was the final shot. I was no longer the daughter sitting at the extra table. I was the person in charge of their destruction, and the audit was just beginning. They arrived 20 minutes late. They complained about the downtown traffic like their time was the only thing that mattered. My father fixed his tie and looked around the expensive office like he belonged there. My sister checked her face in the glass. She did not know the floor under her was not hers anymore. My mother let out a practiced tired sigh. She asked the receptionist when the senior partner would finally see them to talk about their small money issue. I was already sitting there. My back was toward them in a high leather chair. I listened as they talked about me like I was an absent ghost. They called me a tough daughter who would eventually fix her own mess while they saved the family's image. When the lawyer finally nodded at me, I turned my chair to face them. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. My sister's fake smile did not just fade, it disappeared. My mother's face turned white. Her hand went to her throat like she was trying to breathe. My father just stared. His mouth opened and closed as he tried to find a world where his discarded daughter was sitting in the seat of power. "Hello, Robert Susan," I said evenly. I did not call them mom or dad. I had ended our relationship weeks ago. Now it was just a business deal. I realized then that their love had been a subscription service and I had finally stopped paying for it. "Wendy, what is this?" my father managed to say. I did not answer him directly. Instead, I put two papers on the table. The first was the legal loan agreement from when I was 23. It was the one where they charged me interest to fix a car so I could work. The second was the evidence of the forgery. It showed the papers where Robert had stolen $45,000 from Calb's trust. "You think your status is a right, but it's just a lie," I said. My voice was calm and lethal. "This is the illusion of an empty wallet. Their entire life was a show. It was a luxury brand built on stolen dreams and debt. They were not powerful. They were just tenants in a house of cards I now owned." Robert jumped forward. His face turned a dark, scared red. He started talking fast about family and misunderstandings. I did not stop him. I listened the way I was trained to do during hospital meetings. I watched him reveal his own desperation. I stood up. My leg held my weight perfectly. It was the leg they refused to pay for. I leaned across the table and looked my father directly in the eye. "You don't owe me $12,000 for a surgery, Robert. I said you owe Caleb a future, and I am here to collect every cent." I handed my lawyer the signed eviction notice. I was no longer the silent partner in their lies. I was the person in charge of their reality, and the audit was over. The fallout was not a loud explosion. It was the quiet sound of things being sold. The house I grew up in was sold within 30 days to get back the money I now controlled. I did not keep the profit for myself. I did not need to fund my life with their wreckage. Instead, I used the money to get a great commercial lease and a full set of high-end equipment. I walked into a new mechanic shop on the edge of Boston. It was filled with the smell of new tires and real hope. I handed the deed to Calb. For the first time in 26 years, he did not look tired. He looked like a man who finally owned the ground he stood on. My father, my mother, and my sister moved into a small 2-bedroom rental. The carpet was dirty, and they had no status there. Robert spent his days answering letters from the district attorney about the $45,000 he had stolen from his own son. There were no more vintage cars, no more fancy dinners, and no more acting like they were successful. They found out that a family built on money eventually goes bankrupt. I went back to the operating room 6 months after the surgery they refused to pay for. As I washed my hands, the water was cold and the silence was total. I looked at my hands. These were the hands my father decided were not worth $12,000. They were better than they had ever been. I realized then that letting go of a family is not a betrayal. It is a surgical necessity. It is cutting off a bad part to save the rest of the body. I have learned that family is not the name on your birth certificate. It is the person who sells their livelihood so you can walk again. It is the loyalty that shows up when there is blood on the floor. I opened my phone one last time. I found their names and hit delete. I did not feel angry and I did not feel like I had won. I just felt the solid weight of my own 2 feet on the ground.